Was there a religious revival in the area of Palmyra, New York in 1820, as Joseph Smith claims? Eric, we're going to discuss this whole issue of the alleged revival that took place in Palmyra, New York.
Yeah, the overall idea is that the first vision is so important in Mormonism. 15th President Gordon B. Hinckley said this, Bill, in 2002 at a general conference. Our whole strength rests on the validity of that vision. It either occurred or it did not occur. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. Upon that unique and wonderful experience stands the validity of this church. That's from the Ensign magazine, page 80 of November 2002.
Now, certainly the first vision is absolutely important and absolutely essential when it comes to the Mormon story. However, you can't really understand the whole reason for that first vision unless you go back a little bit and look a little at the history leading up to this alleged first vision. That can be found in Joseph Smith's story, and that is found in the Pearl of Great Price, where Joseph Smith claims in verse 5 of section 1 of his story, he says, "Sometime in the second year after our removal to Manchester, there was in the place where we lived an unusual excitement on the subject of religion. It commenced with the Methodist, but soon became general among all the sects in that region of country. Indeed, the whole district of country seemed affected by it, and great multitudes united themselves to the different religious parties, which created no small stir and division amongst the people, some crying, 'Lo here,' and others, 'Lo there.' Some were contending for the Methodist faith, some for the Presbyterian, and some for the Baptist." Now, what makes this important is in verse 7, where he says, Joseph Smith claims that he was at this time in my 15th year. Smith was born in 1805. His birthday is in December, so we can pinpoint this as being the year 1820. Now, there's no dispute about that date, is there, among Latter-day Saints?
No. In fact, in Gospel Principles, which is a correlated curriculum manual, it says, in the spring of 1820, one of the most important events in the history of the world occurred. The time had come for the marvelous work and wonder of which the Lord had spoken. And so, talking about the first vision, that's on page 96. Very clear throughout. I don't think there's any disputing. 1820 is the year.
Probably no more definitive work on this subject has been done other than from the late Reverend Wesley Walters. Wes Walters put out a publication that was known as New Light on Mormon Origins from the Palmyra, New York revival. This came out in the 1960s based on research that he did. And we're going to be citing it a lot because this is an excellent resource if you want to know a lot about the background dealing with this alleged revival. He says in 1834 and 35, nearly 4 years before Joseph began to write his first vision story, the Mormons published an account of the origin of their movement written by Joseph Smith's right-hand man, Oliver Cowdery. He notes that Cowdery makes no reference to any vision occurring in 1820 and dates the revival in 1823. And he also mentions that Cowdery claimed to have received his information from the prophet himself. So he gets this information from Joseph Smith. According to Cowdery's version, Joseph, at age 17, was stirred by a revival that broke out under the preaching of a Mr. Lane, a presiding elder of the Methodist Church. He mentions on page 11 of this booklet that Reverend Lane was a key figure in the Methodist awakening. So if he is a key figure when it comes to this awakening or this particular revival that supposedly happened in 1820, does the evidence even show that Reverend Lane was there? Now, we also know that the Presbyterian minister that was involved in this religious excitement mentioned by Joseph Smith was a man by the name of Stockton, Benjamin B. Stockton. But here's what's interesting is that we know that Benjamin Stockton was serving as a pastor in a town about 50 miles away. He wasn't even in the Palmyra area during the time of 1820, nor do we find Reverend Lane being in that area because as he states on page 15, Wes Walters says, the records, however, of both the Presbyterian and Methodist churches to which Mr. Stockton and Mr. Lane respectively belonged make it clear that neither of these men were assigned to the Palmyra area until 1824.
4 years later.
Exactly. We find on page 16 where he says that Reverend George Lane was assigned to serve the Susquehanna district in central Pennsylvania, over 150 miles from Palmyra. He served this area for 5 years, and not until July of 1824 did he receive an appointment to serve as the presiding elder of the Ontario district in which Palmyra is located. Wes Walters goes on to say, any revival, therefore, in which both Lane and Stockton shared, as the accounts of Oliver Cowdery and William Smith both indicate, has to fall in the latter half of the year 1824 and not in the year 1820. So we have these two principal players in this revival not even getting to the area of Palmyra until 4 years after this event supposedly took place, if you're going to believe the Joseph Smith account in the Pearl of Great Price. And you know, Eric, every Mormon we've talked to pinpoints it at 1820.
Well, let's just talk about real quick the consequences of this. If you're not going to see the Father and the Son until 1824, what do we do about that, especially with Moroni?
Well, because if that's the way it really happened, and this is why I think the Mormon Church has to tenaciously hold on to this erroneous date. And let me remind you, listeners, it is an erroneous date, but the Mormon Church keeps on fostering this erroneous date because they know the problem. If the revival that Smith is talking about in his testimony here in the Pearl of Great Price really took place in 1824, and if we're also going to believe that it was Moroni that appeared to Joseph Smith to tell him about the gold plates that contained what came to be known as the Book of Mormon, that means Moroni becomes the first vision.
Wow.
Not the Father and the Son.
That's problematic.
It is very problematic, but this is why the church has to hold on to this 1820 date, as wrong as it is. Now, here's why we know it's definitely wrong. Well, I shouldn't say we, because it wasn't me. It was Wes Walters has come across a lot of this evidence to show the problems in the official account. He says this on page 16 of his booklet, New Light on Mormon Origins. An even more surprising confirmation that this revival occurred in 1824 and not in 1820 has just recently come to light. While searching through some dusty volumes of early Methodist literature at a nearby Methodist college, imagine our surprise and elation when we stumbled upon Reverend George Lane's own personal account of the Palmyra revival. It was written not some years' distance from the event, as the Mormon accounts all were, but while the revival was still in progress and was printed a few months later. Lane's account gives us not only the year 1824, but even the month and date. According to George Lane's report, the Lord's gracious work in Palmyra, quote, commenced in the spring and progressed moderately until the time of the quarterly meeting, which was held on the 25th and 26th of September, 1824. So he was there.
That magazine was a Methodist magazine from April 1825, referring back to within the past year. So it was very close to, it was actually within the revival still.
Now remember, Joseph Smith claimed that there was an unusual excitement on the subject of religion, and as a result there was great multitudes uniting themselves to the different religious parties. This is what Smith claims. However, when we go and we look at the records of the churches that were involved in 1820, we don't find any of this, great multitudes being added to the church. According to Wes Walters, he says the Baptist Church records also show clearly that they had no revival in 1820, for the Palmyra congregation gained only 6 by baptism. We find that the Methodist figures, though referring to the entire circuit, give the same results, for they show net losses of 23 for 1819, 6, a loss of 6 in 1820. They probably became Baptists, maybe, I don't know. and then 40 for 1821. So, and as far as the Presbyterians are concerned, they really showed no change one way or the other. So there is no huge multitudes being added to the churches in 1820. So again, we have a problem with the date. However, we do know that there were great multitudes that were added to the churches in 1824, which would confirm what Joseph Smith says as far as the revival is concerned, but it wouldn't confirm the date that he's trying to give us in order to believe it. Now, I've heard some Mormons argue, yeah, but there was a Methodist camp meeting in 1820. I've heard some of the best and brightest use this argument as an apologetic for this. But here's the problem. You don't have the great multitudes being added to the church. And besides, Smith isn't talking about a Methodist camp meeting. He's talking about a combined effort from three major denominations in the area, the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. You can't point to an 1820 Methodist camp meeting and somehow think that gets Joseph Smith off the hook. It doesn't. You have to include all three, and you have to include the same events that took place during that revival.
And he refers to the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists in verse 5 of his account in Scripture. So I don't think you can use that very easily.
No, you can't. But we do know that as a result of the revival that took place in 1824, that around 400 people came to profess faith in Christ. So that would certainly seem to pinpoint the one that Joseph Smith is talking about, but then again, we have the wrong date. Folks, this is important, and if you're a Latter-day Saint, it behooves you to check into this, because if we have a problem on this timeline, then we have a problem from the very beginning of the story of Mormonism.
Bill, real quick, as we finish the show, some people might want to get this New Light on Mormon Origins. How can they get this?
We do actually carry it at MRM. If they were to go to mrm.org, they would see it listed there in our bookstore, but it's a very worthwhile study, and I would encourage every person who's serious about studying the origins of Mormonism to look into this, and I would certainly encourage every Latter-day Saint to look into this story, because if the foundation is faulty, then what does that say about everything else that's built on top of this foundation? What if the first vision was really nothing more than an invention made by Joseph Smith? Naturally, we know if you ever talk to a Mormon that they would place a lot of emphasis on the first vision when Joseph Smith claimed to have been visited by both the Father and Jesus Christ.
And that's because their leaders have stressed this so much, Bill. Gordon Hinckley, the 15th president, said this: every claim that we make concerning divine authority, every truth that we offer concerning the validity of this work, all finds its roots in the first vision of the boy prophet.
Whenever you hear the Mormon story being told, either in a Mormon book or by a Mormon general authority, when they're recapping the beginning of Mormonism, the first vision is always right there, prominently displayed as one of the most important events. In fact, they've even talked about that as being one of the most important events in history, in the history of the world. But there's some interesting aspects to this that need to be examined. For instance, Mormon historian James B. Allen actually admits that the first vision narrative, as it's understood by modern LDS members, is suspiciously absent for much of Mormonism's early history. Now, why would that be? You would think if this is really the most important event in the world's history, one of the most important events, that it would be right there, easily to be examined and easily to be understood, and of course easily to be believed. But yet that doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, it's the bedrock, Bill, of this religion. It's the cornerstone. In the Pearl of Great Price Student Manual, Religion 327, it says at the bottom, it says it's the most important event in the history of the world. I mean, it's just it's something that, if it's that important, then I think that it's going to be mentioned early on as well as it should be mentioned today.
If it really happened. Now, here's what's interesting is James B. Allen, he actually wrote about this, and he says, according to Joseph Smith, he told the story of the vision immediately after it happened in the early spring of 1820. As a result, he said, he received immediate criticism in the community. Allen says there is little, if any, evidence, however, that by the early 1830s Joseph Smith was telling the story in public. At least if he was telling it, no one seemed to consider it important enough to have recorded it at the time. And no one was criticizing him for it. Not even in his own history did Joseph Smith mention being criticized in this period for telling the story of the first vision. The interest, rather, was in the Book of Mormon and the various angelic visitations connected with its origin. Now, Allen goes on to say that none of the available contemporary writings about Joseph Smith in the 1830s, none of the publications of the church in that decade, and no contemporary journal or correspondence yet discovered mentions the story of the first vision is convincing evidence that at best it received only limited circulation in those early days. Now, if the first vision story was actually being circulated, you would think that Smith's critics would have found this to be something to go after. But yet Allen says that the earliest anti-Mormon literature, and I hate that term, but anyway, that's his term, the earliest anti-Mormon literature attacked the Book of Mormon and the character of Joseph Smith, but never mentioned the first vision. No. And you would think for sure that if that happened, that of course would have been a target for many of the Christian pastors, churches, Christians around there to go after, because of course we have a problem with that first vision where Joseph Smith says that he claimed to have been visited by God the Father and Jesus. But why is it nobody seems to go after it? It's because it's not being told. Nobody knows about this story in the early years of Mormonism. But if you were to bring that up to most Latter-day Saints, and you know we have, Eric, they would say that's absurd, because they are told at the very beginning that there had to be this first vision. It all goes back to 1820, 10 years before the Mormon Church was even founded. So it becomes a paramount importance if they're going to understand the Mormon narrative. You've got to go back to this first vision. But yet, why is it? And there were critics of Joseph Smith in those early years. You would have Alexander Campbell, you would have E.D. Howe, you'd have Ezra Booth, John Correll, J.B. Turner. None of these guys criticized the first vision.
Somebody should have if you have a whole bunch. If you only had one or two critics, I could see maybe they just missed it, but not as many as he had.
Well, even Allen admits that not until 1843. Now, the church was founded in 1830, so this is 13 years after the church is founded.
And 23 years after the 1820 account, if it's true.
23 years after. The New York Spectator printed a reporter's account of an interview with Joseph Smith. That was the first time that we hear some criticism or even a reference to this first vision. So Allen goes on to say that it wasn't until 1842 that a detailed account of the first vision was printed in a Mormon publication. And that was in the Times and Seasons. It actually began printing in 1839. The Times and Seasons began publication in 1839, but the story of the first vision was not told in it until 1842. So again, many years after the fact, that's when this story starts to pop up. Now, we do see in his diary, though, in his 1832 diary, Joseph Smith does give some kind of an account of a vision that he had, but it was only with the Lord. It wasn't with God the Father or Jesus.
This is what his 1832 diary says, Bill. It says, while in the attitude of calling upon the Lord in the 16th year of my age.
16th, we need to point that out.
Yeah, a pillar of, and he crossed out fire, and he put light above the brightness of the sun at noonday, come down from above and rested upon me, and I was filled with the Spirit of God. And the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord, and he spake unto me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee.
So in other words, the whole intent is a little bit different. What he hears is different. The personage who shows up, of course, is changed. Well, I shouldn't say change, because the Lord, we would assume this is speaking of Jesus, and of course he does include Jesus in the official account, but no mention of God the Father. Isn't that telling? It's like this story is being embellished as the years go on. Now, being embellished, but to whom? Because nobody seems to know about this story. In fact, I think that's why there are so many different accounts of this first vision by various Mormon leaders over the years.
Now, in the court of law, they don't look too kindly on changing of stories as time goes on. I think that's something that we need to point out, that if you're going to trust somebody, their story should be all the same. I mean, the story of the resurrection of Jesus, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, remained the same. I mean, from a very early creed and all these different people who said the same thing. It wasn't something that evolved over time.
Well, very quickly, let's take the rest of our time here to talk about some of the differences in the story by other contemporaries in the early Mormon church. You have, for instance, Brigham Young. Brigham Young actually says, this is Discourses of Brigham Young, page 108, "The Lord did not come with the armies of heaven in power and great glory, nor send his messengers panoplied with aught else than the truth of heaven, to communicate to the meek, the lowly, the youth of humble origins, the sincere inquirer after the knowledge of God, but he did send his angel to this same obscure person, Joseph Smith, who afterwards became a prophet."
And third President John Taylor says a very similar thing. He says, how did this state of things called Mormonism originate? We read that an angel came down and revealed himself to Joseph Smith and manifested unto him in vision the true position of the world in a religious point of view.
Now that would pinpoint it back to the official account, because the official account states that Joseph Smith went to inquire about God, about which church was true, based on what happened in that alleged revival that they say took place in 1820, which of course we know that revival he describes really took place in 1824 and not 1820 at all. It was that same John Taylor that said none of them was right, okay, speaking as to what he was told, just as it was when the prophet Joseph asked the angels which of the sex was right that he might join it. The answer was that none of them are right. So dealing again with those angels that he angel that he talked about earlier, Wilford Woodruff, the fourth president, also said, "The Lord heard Joseph Smith's prayer and sent his angel to him."
Right.
Again, we don't hear God the Father being mentioned. And, I mean, this is years after the fact. So if it's not being told as part of the early Mormon history, you can understand why some of these men might have a different understanding. It wasn't being repeated over and over again like we hear Mormons repeating it today, such leaders as, Past Gordon Hinckley and such like that. The story now is etched permanently in the mind of every Latter-day Saint. They all pretty much know exactly what happened in that first vision. But back then, that doesn't seem to be the case. So what do we do with this? What does a Latter-day Saint do with this? Hopefully they will see that we have a problem right at the very beginning of Mormon history. If they can't seem to get this first vision accurately told, then that tells us that maybe it didn't happen the way Mormons believe it today. I think that's important. I think a Latter-day Saint needs to go back and look into this, because if it didn't happen the way the church is telling them, and then the church is not being honest with them. That's the crux of the matter. The Mormon church has wasted a lot of ink to tell this story the way it appears in their official version, the 1838 account they call it. They've wasted a lot of ink telling this story over and over and over again. But yet if it didn't happen, then what does that say about the whole Mormon story?
Gordon Hinckley said in 1961, Bill, either Joseph talked with the Father and the Son, or he did not. If he did not, we are engaged in blasphemy. I think that's something a lot of Mormons who might be hearing us right now are thinking, oh, they're not telling the truth. They don't know what they're talking about. We're asking you, look this up, check it out, and if it's not true, Gordon Hinckley says you're engaged in blasphemy.
And why would he use the word blasphemy? That's pretty strong, because we would not believe that God the Father appeared to Joseph Smith. At least he would not have been alive to tell about it later on. And if it isn't a great blasphemy, Latter-day Saint, I hope you would understand why Christians have such a sense of urgency to tell you about this, because if you are engaged in a great blasphemy, you need to know about this. You need to check it out. You need to listen carefully to what your non-Mormon friends are trying to talk to you. Hopefully you will consider this information and make the proper decision regarding it.